When Ciro Vitanza, the most quietly feared man on Bay Street, watched his senior financial analyst reach across his desk on a Tuesday morning and catch her sleeve, he went very still. She said she'd slept on her wrist wrong. He had grown up around men who left marks exactly that shape on the people they believed belonged to them. That same evening, her live-in boyfriend loaded a single duffel bag into his car, drove north on the 400, and was never seen in Toronto again. The September air off Lake Ontario had a particular bite that Clementine Harcourt had spent 12 years learning to tolerate without quite ever learning to love. She stood at the corner of King and Bay, waiting for the light, her left hand buried inside her jacket pocket, even though the woman beside her was still in a sleeveless blouse. The bruise circling Clem's wrist was 5 days old, purple going to yellow at the edges now, the color of something nearly healed that hadn't been given the chance to heal properly. She'd worn long sleeves every morning since it happened. She'd told herself it was the weather turning. She was 31 years old, plus size, brown-haired, and possessed of the sharpest financial mind in a tower full of people who were paid very well to have sharp financial minds. She could reconstruct a shredded audit trail in 4 hours. She could identify a shell company buried 6 layers inside a holding structure the way other people identified a bad smell, instinctively, before she'd consciously decided to look. These were the qualities that had earned her a corner office on the 42nd floor of the Vitanza Capital Group Tower, a salary that should have left her comfortable, and a relationship that had quietly, methodically, dismantled all of it. She'd been with Brett Callan for 3 years. He was a regional sales manager at a pharmaceutical distribution company in Etobicoke, easygoing at parties, generous with compliments he directed at everyone in a room except Clem, and privately possessed of careful opinions about everything from how much she spent on groceries to how much space she occupied in a restaurant booth. The savings account she'd built over 4 years had been slowly migrated into joint accounts that only one of them touched freely. The gym membership she'd treated herself to on her 30th birthday had been cancelled after he pointed out she clearly wasn't using it. Last spring, her slow cooker, the heavy one she'd had since university, the one she actually knew how to use, had been donated without her knowledge to a value village 3 neighborhoods over. Last Thursday, he had grabbed her wrist during an argument to stop her from walking away. He'd let go immediately when she made a sound, and then stood looking briefly startled, as though his own grip had surprised him. He'd told her she'd provoked him. He told her she needed to stop making him lose control. She had spent that night on the couch with a bag of frozen peas on her arm, telling herself it was the first time. It was not the first time. The elevator up to 42 was glass-walled, overlooking the lobby's cold marble expanse. Clem stood with her left hand pressed against her thigh, rehearsing the morning briefing in her head. 3 financial scenarios, all clean, the third one carrying a flag she'd need to walk Ciro through carefully. She was good at her job in a way that still occasionally surprised her. Not the knowing part. The fact of being allowed to know. Brett had a way of following her into professional confidence, the way water found cracks. You think they actually respect you? You think you're not just the girl they hired to make themselves look inclusive? She pushed it down as the doors opened and stepped out onto the 42nd floor. The executive office smelled of fresh coffee and cold air conditioning. Marlena at the front desk gave Clem a warm nod and gestured toward the hall. The mahogany door at the far end was already ajar. Ciro Vitanza was standing at the window when she entered, his back to the room, one hand loose at his side, and the other holding a phone he wasn't looking at. He was 44, broad-shouldered, grey, beginning at his temples in a way that made him look less like he was aging, and more like he'd always been this authoritative. His family had operated in Toronto for 4 decades. The Capital Group was real. The portfolios, the quarterly filings, the executive committees. But the actual weight of the Vitanza name in this city ran through the Port of Toronto, through shipping manifests and container logistics and a network of relationships that the organized crime unit had been mapping unsuccessfully for 2 mayoral administrations. Ciro ran it with the particular stillness of someone who had never needed to raise his voice to be the loudest thing in a room. "Morning," Clem said, and began setting out the briefing documents. "Morning, Clementine." He turned from the window and sat across from her. For 40 minutes, she was nothing except the work. She moved through the 3 scenarios cleanly, caught a discrepancy he flagged before he finished the sentence, and answered 2 hard questions from the executive committee pre-read without having to check her notes. She was, in those 40 minutes, entirely herself, certain, quick, worth every dollar of her salary. It was the version of Clementine Harcourt that Brett's voice had the least access to. And then she reached across the table to slide the final appendix toward him, and her sleeve caught on the folder's edge, and it rode up past her wrist. Ciro's eyes dropped. He went very still. She pulled the sleeve down in one motion. "That's everything for the committee package," she said. "What happened to your wrist?" "I slept on it wrong. Woke up with it completely numb. Must have had my arm bent under me. It's mostly fine, just a bit stiff." The lie came out without effort. She had been practicing it for 5 days. He looked at her for a moment that was longer than comfortable. Then he looked back at the appendix. "Leave the folder. I'll go through it this afternoon." He stood. "Get yourself a coffee before Marlena books your morning solid." Clem gathered her things and walked out. She was 3 steps into the hallway when she heard him pick up his phone. The rest of the morning moved around her in its usual shape. 40-some emails, 2 wire approvals. Brett called at 9:15 and again at 10:40, and she let both go to voicemail, then read the text that followed. "You forgot to transfer to the joint account again. Today, please." She had not forgotten. She had made a decision, and then, at 6:40 in the morning, standing in the kitchen before he was awake, she had moved the money anyway. At 2:30, a man she didn't recognize stepped out of the elevator, spoke briefly with Marlena for under a minute, and left. He carried himself the way certain people carried themselves when their job required them to spend significant time standing in parking structures waiting for instructions. At 6:15, Ciro's voice came through the intercom. "Clementine, when you have a moment." The executive office was different after the building cleared out. Overhead lights off, the city throwing its amber and blue up through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The office becoming something more like a room and less like a boardroom. Ciro had cleared one end of the long meeting table, and in its place was food from Canoe. She recognized the restaurant's containers because she ordered from them regularly for client dinners and had never once eaten the meal herself. Duck confit, wild mushroom risotto, sourdough bread that was still warm, a salad that smelled of lemon and fresh herbs, a bottle of something Burgundian sitting open on the sideboard. She stood in the doorway. "Sit down," he said, pulling out a chair. "I should get home. Brett is." "Sit down, Clementine." She sat down. He plated the food himself. He gave her a full portion of the risotto without pausing, without the particular beat that Brett inserted before redirecting her toward the salad, without any of the performance of watching her make choices about her own hunger. A full plate sat in front of her, and Clem felt the familiar tightening, the accounting that had become automatic, the mental arithmetic that turned every meal into a negotiation. "You're not eating," Ciro said. "I'm trying to be careful. Brett thinks we have a wedding in May, and he says if I'm serious about the photos, I should probably." "Stop." She stopped. He set his fork down and looked at her directly. His voice was even and unhurried. "You are the reason the executive committee has never asked a question I couldn't answer, because you build the answers into the documents before anyone thinks to ask. You manage the financial architecture of a 9-figure operation, and you do it with fewer errors in a year than most analysts make in a quarter." He held her gaze. "Your body keeps you alive long enough to do all of that. Eat. She ate. The risotto was extraordinary, warm and rich, the kind of food that asked nothing of the person eating it except presence. She was 3 bites in before she realized she had stopped calculating, stopped monitoring herself from the outside, stopped waiting for a comment that wasn't coming. She ate until she was comfortably, genuinely full. When Ciro made a dry remark about the city's most recently indicted planning commissioner, she laughed, and she didn't check whether that was too loud. It was the most ordinary meal she'd had in 3 years. Then she reached for her water glass. Her left sleeve slid past her wrist, and she saw his expression shift. "Show me," he said quietly. "It's not. Clementine." A long moment. Then she turned her palm up on the table and pushed the fabric to her elbow. The bruise was the shape of a hand. Full grip, thumb to forefinger, wrapping the narrowest part of her wrist, with a secondary mark higher up where the skin had been pinched. 5 days old, and still deeply purple. Ciro looked at it for a long time without touching it. His hands were flat on the table. Something in his jaw was working. "Brett," he said. "We had an argument. He grabbed me to stop me from leaving. He didn't mean for it to. How long has this been going on?" She looked at her own wrist. The honest answer took longer to arrive than she expected, because she had built a careful narrative around time, one that made the duration feel shorter. The control things. Watching the money, monitoring what I eat, cutting me off from people. That's been most of 3 years. She paused. The physical part is newer. How much newer? This is the second time. He nodded once. His hand moved to his phone. "Please don't do anything," Clem said quickly. "You don't know him. If he thinks I talked to someone about this, he'll..." Brett's voice, low and entirely certain. "Nobody's going to side with you, Clem. You know what they'd say. Woman your size, man like me. Who do you think they're going to believe?" "Sal," Ciro said into the phone, his eyes on the window. "I need a car at the front entrance in 45 minutes, and I need everything you have on a Brett Callan, Etobicoke, pharmaceutical sales, within the hour." He set the phone down. "You're going home in my car, with Sal standing at the door. You'll pack for a week. You won't explain anything to Brett while you're doing it. Then you're going to the Hazelton in Yorkville. The booking is already under a different name. I can't just leave." "You've been deciding to leave since the first time he put his hands on you." His voice was quiet. "You've talked yourself out of it every time. Stop talking yourself out of it." She left with Sal 43 minutes later. The apartment in Leslieville was dark and Brett's car wasn't in the lot, and Clem moved through the rooms with the focused efficiency she brought to complex financial problems, methodical, unsentimental, her laptop, her documents, her grandmother's ring from the box in the back of her dresser drawer. Sal stood in the hallway with his hands clasped and didn't speak, and she was more grateful for that than she could have said. She was in the Hazelton by 9:30, in a room overlooking Yorkville's quiet side streets, wearing a hotel robe, her wrist in a proper brace for the first time since the injury. She stared at her phone. Brett's text came at 11. "I've been thinking, and I think we both need to move on. There's someone else and it's gotten serious. Don't contact me. I'll get my things while you're at work." She read it twice. She waited for devastation. She waited for the specific weight of rejection she had been braced against for years. The one that said she should have expected this, that she had always been too much and not enough at the same time, that he'd been doing her a favor all along. It didn't come. What came instead was the sensation of something she'd been carrying for a very long time, quietly, without acknowledging its weight, simply putting itself down. She cried, lying in the hotel bed with the city lights coming through the curtains, but not for Brett Callan. She cried for the version of herself that had stood in the kitchen at 6:40 in the morning moving money into a joint account, and told herself it was just easier this way. Across the city, in the underground parking level of a waterfront building near the Portlands. Brett was having a very different kind of evening. He'd been told to expect a private investment opportunity, passed along through a university contact, something involving a quiet property deal near the lake. He'd dressed up for it. Under the fluorescent lights of the parking structure, he looked deeply out of his depth. Ciro came out of the shadows with his jacket folded over one arm and his sleeves rolled to the elbow. He didn't raise his voice. He had never needed to. The two men who had guided Brett in by his arms stepped back and gave their employer the floor. "In business," Ciro said, his voice carrying cleanly off the concrete, "you evaluate assets and liabilities. The woman you've spent 3 years isolating and draining is the most important financial mind in my organization. She is, in practical terms, irreplaceable." He stopped 2 meters away. "You are a liability, a controlling, reckless liability who has been treating something of enormous value as though it belonged to you." Brett tried to speak. "The bag on the hood of that car contains $150,000, Ciro continued. "It covers the savings you emptied, the credit card debt in her name, and your relocation costs, because you are relocating. North, far enough north that the area code changes." His expression didn't shift. "You will send her one text tonight on your own phone, and you will end things in a way that sounds like your decision. Then you will take the bag, and you will not return." He paused. "If I need to explain the alternative, then I have overestimated your intelligence." Brett took the bag. His thumbs were shaking when he typed the message, but he typed it. 6 months passed. Toronto moved through winter the way it always does, grinding and grey until suddenly the lake showed blue between the last ice flows, and the city seemed to collectively exhale. By March, Clementine Harcourt was walking into the Vitanza Capital Group tower in a deep coral blazer she had bought in her own size without asking anyone's permission, and the woman at the canoe takeout counter on the ground floor knew her order by heart. She had not lost a single pound. It had not occurred to her that she should want to. What she had done: paid off the credit card debt in 3 clean installments, reclaimed her paycheck into her own account, started keeping a proper lunch in the office refrigerator because she was now the kind of person who ate lunch, negotiated a 17% raise and a new title, Director of Financial Operations, in a conversation with Ciro that had taken 11 minutes and gone entirely in her favor, bought herself a coat she'd been eyeing for 2 years, responded to one of Brett's early texts with silence, and then blocked his number on a Sunday afternoon without any particular drama. Marlena brought her coffee in the morning now without being asked. The executive committee had stopped treating her contributions as something requiring extra validation. She still worked closely with Ciro. The dynamic between them had evolved into something neither of them had named, which was probably the correct approach given the complexity of the surrounding circumstances, though it was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as a strategy. He looked at her the way he looked at things he'd decided were under his protection, continuously and without apology. The Portland's expansion file needed an updated portfolio page from the legal team's office in a building 2 blocks over. Clem went to retrieve it herself on a Wednesday afternoon in late March, took the covered walkway behind the tower on her way back, and found someone standing beside the service entrance. Her first thought was that he looked smaller than she remembered. Her second thought was that she had no idea why she had ever been afraid of him. "Brett," she said. He'd burned through the money in 4 months, it showed. His jacket was wrong for the temperature. He had the specific energy of someone who had decided he had nothing left to lose, which was often the most dangerous kind of person to encounter in a covered walkway, and was, in this particular case, deeply miscalculated. "I did some digging," he said, stepping forward. "Your boss isn't exactly running a straight shop. Port contracts, manifests, some very interesting shipping arrangements. $1 million covers my silence. You're good with numbers. Move it from wherever you move things." Clem looked at him for a moment. 3 years ago, Brett had known exactly which register to use to make her feel like the ground was uncertain beneath her. He'd spent considerable effort learning it, the tone that implied she was lucky, the look that said she was too much to deal with, but he was willing to manage it. He had filed that knowledge away and used it regularly, and there had been a time when it worked every single time. She felt nothing now, not even anger particularly. Something cooler than anger, the flatness of someone who has closed the account and knows the balance is zero. "You should leave," she said. "Yeah," he stepped closer. "Or what?" The service door opened. Ciro came out, Sal a step behind him. He had tracked her location through the office system automatically the moment she left the building, standard procedure for senior staff on document retrieval. He came to stand beside her, and his eyes moved from her face to Brett's and back, making the assessment in under 2 seconds. Sal and his associate moved. Brett was against the wall with quiet efficiency. "I gave you a clean exit," Ciro said to Brett, with the tone of someone correcting an invoice error. "I was direct about the conditions. You took the money, you agreed to the terms, and here you are." He shook his head slightly, the way you'd shake your head at a structural failure that was entirely predictable. "That's a very poor return on investment." Clem took 1 step forward. She looked at Brett Callan, the man who had told her she was too much, who had moved her money and cancelled her gym membership and monitored every bite she ate, who had grabbed her wrist in a kitchen argument and then blamed her for his own grip. And she saw him clearly, maybe for the first time. What she saw was someone who had never actually been large enough to share space with her, who had kept chipping pieces off her because the alternative was admitting that she had more to offer than he could match. "You told me I took up too much space," she said. "For 3 years that was the whole argument. Too much space, too much appetite, too much opinion about things that were supposed to be none of my business." She looked at him steadily. "The problem was never my size, Brett. The problem was that you never had enough room in yourself to stand next to someone bigger than you." She turned to Ciro. "The expansion file needs a signature before 4 o'clock. I'll be at my desk." She walked inside without looking back. She heard the vehicle leave the service lane a few minutes later, and after that, the walkway was quiet. Ciro came through the lobby doors 7 minutes after she reached her office. She heard the elevator, heard him come down the hall, heard him stop in her doorway. "You were 10 minutes ahead of me," he said. "I had the file. She didn't look up from her screen. I also needed a minute." He was quiet for a moment. "Are you all right?" The question landed differently from him than it would have from anyone else. It had weight behind it. The weight of someone asking, because the answer actually mattered to them. She looked up. "I think so. I think it might feel strange for a while. The part where I'm not afraid of him." She paused. "I expected to be when I saw him there." "You weren't." "No." He came into the office and closed the door. He sat across from her, across her desk, the one with her name on the placard outside, the one she had negotiated for in a meeting that had gone entirely her way, and he looked at her the way he always looked at things he wasn't finished deciding about, steady and without performance. "Clementine," he said. "Ciro. I've been extremely professional for 6 months." Something warm moved through her, I noticed. "I'm going to stop being extremely professional," his eyes held hers, "if you're comfortable with that." She looked at him, this man who had knelt beside her at a parking structure wall, who had plated her food and told her plainly what she was worth, who had kept a careful, respectful distance for 6 months while she rebuilt the pieces of herself that had been quietly taken apart, who had never once, in any of it, asked her to take up less space. "I'm comfortable with that," she said. He came around the desk and took her face in his hands, and when he kissed her, it arrived without any awkwardness at all, the way things arrived when they had been building long enough to know their own shape. She felt the warmth of him and leaned into it, and the part of her brain that was always helplessly, running calculations, noted, with something like relief, that this was the first time in a very long time that she had been held by someone who reached for her with open hands. When they finally broke apart, he pressed his forehead to hers, and she felt, rather than saw, him smile. "The file still needs signing before 4, she said. 3:50, he agreed and stepped back. "You'll have it on my desk first." "I'll have it on your desk at 3:40. He shook his head, but he was still smiling when he walked out the door, and Clementine Harcourt sat alone in her office for a moment, with the city bright through the windows around her, and the file open on her screen, and her name on the placard outside. Her name, her title, her work, her life, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could honestly remember, that she was taking up exactly as much space as she deserved.